Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and tonight I'd like to take some time to respond to a very interesting question that I received from a friend. And I'll read the question that he wrote, and then we'll explore this interesting question a little bit and try to find some reliable answers, some real truth to help us understand how we should think about this issue. So let me read the question and then we'll get into the details. This friend of mine writes, Mr. Michael, in India, 30 million Christians live along with 1 billion Hindus. Using astrology every day is an essential part of every Hindu's life, both literate and illiterate. An ignorant Hindu may not know about his own religion, but he will be well versed using the almanac and doing everyday work according to the good and bad hours mentioned in it. First step in a Hindu marriage is matching the horoscopes of boy and girl. It is such important to them. It is so important to them. I guess you would be knowing these from Hindus living in the U.S. But the problem is that some Christians are attracted towards these practices. Most Christians here choose a date for wedding according to these almanac dates. Most Hindus attribute their success and happiness to this horoscope practice. Christians are getting attracted towards it for material success and happiness. I understand astrology is the ancient study of heaven, but what are other things like horoscopes, good time, bad time, etc., built around it? Can you please do a talk on it? So here's this question, and as I said, this is a very interesting discussion. Very interesting topic, and it's one of those topics that I can guess how most Christians will respond to it, and when we dig into it, we look at the writings of Thomas Aquinas, and we look to see how scholastic philosophy would answer this question, we're surprised to find that the common answer that Christians will give is not what Catholic doctors taught in the past. It's a little more complex than most modern Christians understand, and by oversimplifying it, we actually miss part of the truth, which is, as I said, a little more complex than we're willing to allow. So what I'd like to do is just sort of dig into this a little bit. Excuse me 1 minute here. I'd like to dig into this a little bit and try to draw out some principles that we can use to not only help us to answer this question, but think about the answer to other questions as well that are similar. Okay, so to really get down to the issue, we have this question about astrology and horoscopes and all this kind of stuff. Now, in America, this friend of mine writing is in India, and he sort of assumes that in America, you probably see this stuff. Well, really, we don't. We don't see much of this. When I went to college at Rutgers University, I was living in New Jersey, and there was a very great population of Indian people who lived in the area in New Jersey. It was very heavily populated with Indian people. I had friends growing up who were Indians, and when I went to college at Rutgers, there were many Indians. I actually worked in a chemistry lab, and my coworker that I worked with and even ate lunch at his house was an Indian. So I spent a lot of time with Indians, and I didn't find that they were very religious. I don't know if the Indians who come to America would be the most, the most faithful Hindus. They would probably be more secular-minded, I think, than Indians living in India. But I never really saw much of the religious beliefs, or I never really talked much about the religious beliefs of others. I really didn't learn much about Hinduism until I spent some time with the Missionaries of the Poor back in 2009, 2010, and there were a number of brothers in the Missionaries of the Poor who were converted Hindus, and they taught me quite a bit about Hinduism and its relationship, where Catholics and Hindus sort of live alongside each other. And they talked about Hinduism pretty favorably, like sort of how Mother Teresa did when she was teaching that to be a good Hindu is better than being, just a depraved sinner. So the effect of Hinduism isn't necessarily as bad as some sort of like depraved life, just like given over to carnal indulgence. But anyway, what my friend here writes about is that Hinduism has sort of all of this astrology and horoscope type information worked into it. And Christians, because they're living alongside these Hindus in India, and they sort of mingle and rub off on one another, they start to pick up this interest in maybe what the stars have to say about different events, or trying to predict what might happen in a different undertaking based on the stars. So when we think about these things, like I said, usually there is the lazy modern Christian response, which says, no, there's one God, and God does whatever he wants. That's the only truth, and the stars have absolutely no influence on anything. They're just made by God as sort of decorations out in the heavens. God controls everything. The stars are irrelevant. All that matters is God's will, and we just have to do his will on earth. Well, that sounds like a nice, simple answer, but it's not actually what the church teaches. It's not even what God himself teaches in the scriptures. And really, we know better than this. We know that this is not true. And I can give you a very, very simple example, which I've talked about before. If you go to the ocean, and there are a lot of people who've never been to the ocean. They live, deep inside the interior land of a country or whatever, and they may not even spend much time at the ocean. But when you go to the ocean, one of the amazing phenomena that you observe is the changing of the tides. I grew up visiting the shore all the time, going to the beach, so I took this for granted. But later, when you get into scientific studies and learn about the changing of the tides, and you ask, what actually causes the changing of the tides? What causes the whole level of the ocean? And we're talking about the ocean. We're not talking about a little swimming pool with some water in it. We're talking about the ocean. What causes the water of the ocean to rise hundreds of feet, to move up the coast and move so quickly and so significantly that you have to move your beach chairs and stuff, because it comes creeping up the shore, and all of this water comes up and then it recedes twice a day. And we learn that the tides, think of how much force would be needed to move the waters of the oceans. We find out that these tides are caused by the heavenly bodies, by the influence, let's say, of the moon upon the waters of the oceans. And if you dig into it further, you'll find that the heavenly bodies have the same effect on the dry land too, as they do on the water. They also have an effect on the dry land, and there's a phenomenon called terrestrial tides, where the land actually rises and falls, much less significantly than the waters of the ocean, but nevertheless, the heavenly bodies certainly have an influence on the earth. And if we stand and look and think that the heavenly bodies are causing the levels of the oceans to rise and fall throughout the day, do we really believe that they don't have any effect on the plants or on the animals or on us? It would be much more reasonable to assume that they do have an effect on us. And so we come to this dilemma, okay? What is the effect that these heavenly bodies have on earthly bodies? How do these effects actually affect life on earth as we're living? How do the heavenly bodies actually influence life? And is there a way for us, by studying the heavenly bodies, is there a way for us to understand these effects and use this knowledge to actually make decisions so that we can avoid acting contrary to the effects of the heavenly bodies, and as far as possible act in harmony with the effects of the heavenly bodies? So we can see that there is some reason, there is some sense in wanting to understand the effects of the heavenly bodies and live in harmony with those effects, not live contrary to those effects. So there is some reason in this idea of astrology, trying to study and understand the movements and the influences of heavenly bodies on earthly bodies. There is reason in that. So where do things get wacky? That's the question we really have to ask. Where do we move from this relatively simple, innocent desire to understand how the heavenly bodies influence the earthly bodies? How do we move from that to some kind of sinful, superstitious astrology that goes too far, right? And where is that line? What's the difference between good astrology, as I described before, and this bad astrology that goes too far? How do we understand what this is? Well, you might be surprised, but St. Thomas Aquinas answers this question directly in the Summa Theologica. So this isn't something we need to sit around and wonder about. St. Thomas has answered this question. If you're interested in finding it, you might just want to jot down this reference. I'm going to pull the text up on the screen in just a minute, but it's the second part of part 2 of the Summa Theologica, question number 95. So the second part of the Summa, question 95, and I'm going to read Article 5. So question 95, Article 5 of the second part of the Summa Theologica. And the question that St. Thomas investigates in this article is whether divination by the stars is unlawful, whether divination by the stars is unlawful, whether it's sinful to try and read signs from the stars, to interpret the stars and seek some sort of knowledge to live according to on earth, whether that's sinful. So St. Thomas answers this directly. And like I said, the oversimplified modern Christian answer is not the truth. And we're going to see St. Thomas unpack this for us and get into it. So what I'm going to do is flip over to this split screen here. And what we're looking at here, let me actually pull it into a separate window so we don't have to look at all this. What we're looking at here is a copy of the Summa Theologica that I use for my private studies. You can look up at the web address and copy it if you'd like. It's classicalliberarts.com/library-text/summa.txt, and this is a text copy of the entire Summa Theologica in one file. And I like to use this for my own studies because it's simple, first of all, and I like to study simple text. But secondly, I can search the entire Summa anytime that I want to look for a certain phrase or keyword or expression that I'm searching for. But what I did here, so for example, if I want to get into this, I know that he deals with the topic, and I know he talks about the stars. So I just search for stars in the text, and then I go through the results and find the passage that I'm thinking of. So that's what we're looking at here on this screen. I should probably zoom in a little bit. Let me see if I can make the text a little bigger so maybe you can read along. It might make this slow because it's a huge file. So this is question 95. It's going to bump me around here. Let me just go find the passage. Just give me 1 second and I'll find that spot we were just at. Okay, so question 95 of the second part article number 5, sorry, whether divination through the stars is unlawful. Okay, so here we go. And we'll just read through this and I'll make some comments, but we'll draw some helpful principles out of this that addresses this question, and then we'll talk about a specific application of it to this question about Hinduism and Christians living alongside Hindus and things like that. But St. Thomas asks whether divination by the stars is unlawful. And he comes down, let's start with these objections because they're actually helpful. And remember, the objections are wrong answers. The objections are the opposing answers or opposing arguments that Thomas rejects and disproves. So when you read the Summa, be careful to remember that if you're reading the objections, those are false arguments, and St. Thomas's answer comes down a little later. The first objection or opposing view is it would seem that divination by the stars is not unlawful. It is lawful to foretell effects by observing their causes. Thus, a physician foretells death from the disposition of the disease. Sorry, it's late. Now, the heavenly bodies are the cause of what takes place in the world, according to Dionysius. Therefore, divination by the stars is not unlawful. So the first argument is that the heavenly bodies are the cause of what takes place in the world. Just as we said, the heavenly bodies are the causes of the rising and the falling of the tides. The heavenly bodies are the causes of what takes place in the world. Therefore, trying to read the signs in the heavenly bodies and use that to predict what's going to take place on earth so that we can live according to that wisdom can't be unlawful. That's the first argument. The second argument is human science originates from experiments, according to Aristotle, Metaphysics. Now, it has been discovered through many experiments that the observation of the stars, the scientific observation of the stars, I mean, we're allowed to look at them, aren't we? We're allowed to study them. It has been discovered through many experiments that the observation of the stars is a means whereby some future events may be known beforehand. For example, we can predict when an eclipse is going to take place. We can predict it because we know the motions of the heavenly bodies, and we can predict what's going to happen. Do you think that an eclipse has no effect on the earth? Of course it does. So by studying the heavens scientifically, we can begin to understand patterns of movement, and we can predict future events. Therefore, it would seem not unlawful to make use of this kind of divination. Third argument, divination is declared to be unlawful insofar as it is based on a compact made with the demons. But divination by the stars contains nothing of the kind, but merely an observation of God's creatures, the stars themselves. We're not making a deal with any demons. We're not invoking any evil spirits to assist us. We're simply observing God's creatures, just as we do the rocks and the plants and the animals on the earth. Therefore, it would seem that this species of divination is not unlawful. So we have three arguments that say divination by the stars is simply observing the natural world and using that knowledge to draw conclusions. Therefore, it can't be unlawful. So those are three, I would argue, good arguments, right? Good arguments for being able to use the knowledge of the heavens to make predictions and try to make decisions on earth based on what we observe. But St. Thomas goes on and says here, on the contrary, St. Augustine says in the Confessions, those astrologers whom they call mathematicians, I consulted without scruple. Because they seemed to use no sacrifice, nor pray to any spirit for their divinations, which art, however, Christian and true piety rejects and condemns. So here we have in St. Augustine, and it looks like there's a typo, that word art. I don't believe that. I don't believe that's right. But we have a principle in the teaching of St. Augustine. He says, if we take this idea of divination, we have to divide it into two different kinds. There are two different things going on. There's one group of people who are simply looking at the heavenly bodies like scientists. He refers to them here as the mathematicians. They look at the heavenly bodies and by studying them physically, try to use that knowledge to predict future events. And he says, well, this is just science. This is just natural science, natural philosophy. There's nothing wrong with that. He says, I consulted them without scruple because they used no sacrifice nor prayed to any spirit for their divinations. Okay, so here we have the important distinction. And I think this is an important principle, and we're going to get more into this. So just be patient. But the important principle is this, okay? And let's really get this clear because this answers this question, okay? If we're using natural observations of natural physical bodies that were created by God, and we're using our observations of these physical bodies to learn about patterns that exist in the world and which we can expect will continue into the future, we can then use that knowledge to predict the future because these events are likely going to continue to recur. So that natural knowledge of the physical bodies, of the created bodies themselves, that's simply scientific observation. And of course we can use it to predict the future because we recognize patterns. And in modern natural science, there's something called the principle of uniformity. The principle of uniformity, which is the idea that, let's say, laws of nature will continue uniformly. So we can make predictions about the future based upon current and past observations. Okay? So anything that is natural, anything that is limited to nature, is simply scientific study, and the whole point of scientific study is to benefit from that knowledge and be able to make decisions that lead us, that help us to avoid undesirable events in the future. That's just what science is for. So when a physician studies the body and studies the different effects of different different substances on the body or different habits of the body. The whole point of that art is to try to understand what's going to happen so that we can avoid disease and put ourselves in a position through good habits where we expect good health reasonably, according to nature. That's not some kind of unlawful divination trying to predict the future of our health. That's just scientific thinking. That's part of what makes us human. So this principle in Augustine is that anything that's limited to what is natural is good. But where the line is the minute that we begin to move beyond what is natural, and we don't merely observe what is natural, but we begin to look for something supernatural to assist us. We don't merely observe what's happening naturally, but we seek to do something that will actually influence those future events, and we do so in an unlawful spiritual way. And this is what Hinduism would be getting into if it gets into some sort of religious practice or a sacrifice or prayers. So this is where St. Thomas draws the line. And he's just quoting St. Augustine at this point. But what he says is if it's natural observation, using natural observations to forecast future events, just like we do with the weather every day, there's nothing sinful about that. But if we go beyond that, to try to gain some favor or benefit, or gain some knowledge of the future that goes beyond what we can observe in nature by the assistance of some spirit, or by gaining the favor of some spirit by offering some sacrifice or something like that, that's unlawful divination. So there's a line, and the question about astrology depends on whether we stay on the safe side of the line or whether we cross that line and get into some kind of superstitious, idolatrous divination. So let's continue to read what St. Thomas says, because he explains this in more detail. So that doubt was introduced to those three arguments by a quote from St. Augustine in the Confessions. So now St. Thomas goes on to explain his answer to this question. He says, as stated above, the operation of the demon thrusts itself into those divinations which are based on false and vain opinions, in order that man's mind may become entangled in vanity and falsehood. So here is the danger of this interest in divination or future telling, fortune telling, and so on. Evil spirits sort of lurk about these issues because, they know that we're looking for the future for a reason. We're anxious about the future. We're concerned about the future, and so on. We're in a position of vulnerability because we're concerned about the future, and we're concerned to a degree that we may be willing to do something bizarre to try to satisfy these anxieties or cares that we have. So he says the demons thrust themselves into those divinations which are based on false and vain opinions, in order that man's mind may become entangled in vanity and falsehood. So the demons use these things to lead us into confusion and error. So they're dangerous. They're dangerous because this desire that we have to understand the future, there's something unhealthy about it in most cases. There's something unhealthy about it, and that puts us into a spiritually vulnerable condition. St. Thomas goes on to say, one makes use of a vain and false opinion if, by observing the stars, one desires to foreknow the future that cannot be forecast by their means. One desires to know in advance the future that cannot be forecast by their means. So let me explain this a little bit based on the philosophy here behind the scenes so that we can continue reading this and it be clear for us. So when St. Thomas talks about foreknowing things that cannot be forecast by their means, what can be forecast by their observation are natural effects of the heavenly bodies themselves, like the rising and falling of the tides. That's something that can be foreknown by the observation of the stars. And when the ancients talk of the stars, they include the sun and the moon often in with everything that they refer to as the stars. So we know that by studying the heavenly bodies, we can predict what time the tides will rise and fall. We do that every day. You can go online or in the newspaper and see the times of the tides. We can expect when the tides will change based on our observations of the heavens, because these are future events that can be forecast by the observation of the heavenly bodies. And the principle here is that the heavenly bodies have a physical effect on natural bodies on earth, like water and like the land, on plants, on animals, on us, and so on. The heavenly bodies do have a physical effect on physical bodies on the earth. And so, as far as nature is concerned, as far as the natural movements and inclinations of physical bodies is concerned, we can, by the observation of the heavenly bodies, foreknow the future, because their effect on physical bodies can be known, can be observed, and can be used to know the future. Okay? So keep that in mind. The heavenly bodies do have a physical effect on earthly bodies, and we can study that scientifically, understand it, and expect it. We can foreknow the future. Now, the problem with this is that our bodies, for example, human bodies, are affected by the heavenly bodies, but our bodies, our human bodies, are subject to our reason. They're subject to free will. So the heavenly bodies may have an effect on us. It may be, hard to measure, but it may be real nonetheless. And we may resist that influence by our own free choices, by our own decisions and intentional movements and actions that we carry out by our own will and desire. So our physical body by itself is subject to the movements and activities of heavenly bodies, but our body is also subject to our own will and reason. So we're not moved by heavenly bodies in the same way that the water of the ocean is moved by the heavenly bodies, and therefore what human beings are going to do cannot be foreknown in the future, because human freedom of the will and reason is ultimately the cause of human activities. And so we cannot use a knowledge of the stars to predict future events that are subject to human decisions and actions. And so you can see, well, boy, isn't that what we're really interested in? Isn't it really the future of human actions that we might be most interested in? Yes, and that's why things become dangerous. Because I want to know what this person is going to do. I want to know what's going to happen. If I ask this woman to marry me, I want to know if she's going to say yes or no. I want to know if she's going to be able to have children. I want to know if I do this, if this customer is going to agree and buy my product, or if he's going to decide not to. I'd like to know the future so I can make decisions and not suffer loss. Well, that's the kind of knowledge that the observation of the stars cannot forecast. It cannot foresee events that are subject to human choosing. So we have two different kinds of activities we might be interested in. Physical activities, or physical movements, I should say, of natural bodies on earth, which are subject to the heavens, and the free actions and choices of human beings whose bodies are subject to their understanding and free will. This kind of forecasting cannot predict the future of human events because of those other factors. I've talked about this recently in another talk. These are called contingent events. They're contingent upon other things that affect their outcome. They're contingent upon the decisions that men make or don't make. So the observation of the stars, naturally speaking, cannot foresee contingent events. And therefore, the desire to foreknow contingent events is beyond the limits of nature. And when we pursue that kind of knowledge through the study of the heavenly bodies, that's when we've crossed the line and we're now into trouble. So I hope that clarifies that. I think it's a very easy division to understand. Whatever is natural and physical and therefore influenced by the heavens, that's lawful. Whatever goes beyond that and is not actually subject to the movements of the heavens, but takes into account other influences like human will and human reason, those things are not appropriate for future predictions based on the movements of the stars. So that's the principle to keep in mind. Let's keep reading St. Thomas here. He says, we must consider what things can be foreknown by observing the stars, and it is evident that those things which happen, and pay attention to these key phrases, those things which happen of necessity, according to nature, can be foreknown by this means. Even so, as an example, astrologers can forecast a future eclipse. The weatherman can forecast a storm, and so forth. Okay? So there's no question that the study of the heavens can lead us to accurately forecast the future. We know that. That's obvious. But what's important to notice is that this refers only to the movements of physical bodies. Okay, so it's limited. So let's keep that in mind. Let's keep reading St. Thomas. However, with regard to the foreknowledge of future events acquired by observing the stars, there have been various opinions. Some have stated that stars signify, that they merely serve as signs. Stars signify rather than cause the things foretold by means of their observation. But this is an unreasonable statement. Every corporeal sign, every bodily or physical sign, is either the effect of that for which it stands, such as smoke signifies fire, or it proceeds from the same cause, so that by signifying the cause, in consequence it signifies the effect. Thus, a rainbow is sometimes a sign of fair weather, insofar as its cause is the cause of fair weather. So there's two different relationships between cause and effect. Sometimes a sign shows us the presence of its cause, like smoke points to fire. Sometimes an an effect has the same cause as the effect that we're inquiring about. Like the rainbow tells us that good weather is coming because it's caused by the same effect as the good weather. So there's two different ways that natural bodies can signify things for us. I think that's pretty clear. It cannot be said that the dispositions and movements of heavenly bodies are the effect of future events. Nor again can they be ascribed to some common higher cause of a corporeal or bodily nature, although they are referable to a common higher cause, which is divine providence. On the contrary, the appointment of the movements and positions of the heavenly bodies by divine providence is on a different principle from the appointment of the occurrence of future contingencies. There's that word contingency. Means uncertain events that are dependent on other causes. Because the former are appointed on a principle of necessity, that is, the movements of natural bodies occur necessarily, so they always occur in the same way, whereas the latter are appointed on a principle of contingency, so that the manner of their occurrence is variable. That is, it depends on these variable influences in human, with regard to human activities, human reason and will. Consequently, it is impossible to acquire foreknowledge of the future from an observation of the stars, except insofar as effects can be foreknown from their causes. All right, so St. Thomas makes a clear distinction and draws a clear line. The motions of physical bodies on earth may be of necessity influenced by the heavenly bodies, and therefore they can be predicted based on the observation of the stars. Now, if you think about it, if you think of, let's say, a popular book in America, and I'm sorry if you don't have this in India, but in America we have a popular book. It's not something that anyone takes serious, but it's called The Farmer's Almanac. And it will tell you the best days and best times of the month or whatever to plant seeds or to do different activities in the garden or farm. And the idea is that the positions of the heavenly bodies and their influences on the earth make conditions ideal for certain activities. And therefore, if you get these activities done during these ideal windows of time based on the positions and the influences of the heavenly bodies, you'll have the most success. Now, that may not be true simply because the observations and the predictions may be false, but the idea, as St. Thomas explains here, is actually reasonable. All right, so it's perfectly reasonable that the heavenly bodies would have an effect on seeds and plants and water and things like that, even animals and so on. So it's perfectly possible that those sorts of predictions could be true, that based on the observation of the heavenly bodies, we could make predictions about the behavior of different physical bodies. But man is different. Man is different because of understanding and free will. So those ideas, like you're asking about planting and, different activities of life, insofar as they are physical activities, and we're talking about physical movements, they most certainly could be influenced by the heavenly bodies. And so that's not unreasonable. And if there were ancient Hindu sources that did accurately observe the heavenly bodies and correlate those effects to effects on earth, and had established a system by which they could accurately predict future events, future necessary physical events, that would be perfectly reasonable. All right, so that's why I said the normal Christian response is sort of lazy and overly simplified. It's really pretty obvious that could be true. That's what we do. That's how we predict the weather. That's how we predict storms. That's how we know that a certain event in astronomy is coming, like there's going to be a supermoon, or there's going to be an eclipse, or we're going to see a comet. We do that all the time. So of course that's normal. Another question is whether or not our predictions are true, whether our observations are sufficient to successfully predict events. But as long as it's based on the movement of physical bodies, that's perfectly reasonable. Okay, so that's important to know. But any event or any activity that is contingent and variable because it's dependent on other influences, those are the kinds of things that cannot be foreknown by the observation of the heavens. Okay? Human will is greater than the influence of the heavenly bodies. Okay? That's the idea. Let's keep going here. I don't want to get into too deep stuff, so I'll try to read through this quickly, and then I'll comment on the stuff that I think is most helpful for us. Two kinds of effects escape the causality of heavenly bodies. Two kinds of effects escape or are unaffected by the heavenly bodies. In the first place, all effects that occur accidentally, by chance, whether in human affairs or in the natural order, since, as it is proved in the Metaphysics, Book 6, an accidental being has no cause, least of all a natural cause, such as is the power of a heavenly body. Heavenly bodies are natural causes. Because what occurs accidentally neither is a being, properly speaking, nor is one, for instance, that an earthquake occur when a stone falls, or that a treasure be discovered when a man digs a grave. These and like occurrences are not one thing, but are simply several things. Whereas the operation of nature has always some one thing for its term, just as it proceeds from some one principle, which is the form of a natural thing. In the second place, so again, we can get into some philosophical stuff there that would require some deeper explanation, but it's not necessary for us to understand the point that he's making. There's two kinds of effects that escape the causality of heavenly bodies. The first kind of effect is the effects that occur accidentally. That's the first kind. The second kind, in the second place, acts of free will, which is the faculty of will and reason. These escape the causality of heavenly bodies. For the intellect or reason is not a physical body, nor the act of a bodily organ, and consequently neither is the will, since it is in the reason, as Aristotle shows in his work De Anima, or On the Soul. No body can make an impression on an incorporeal body. So here's a principle. No physical body can make an impression or influence an incorporeal, a non-material or immaterial body, like the soul. A physical body like the stars, cannot make an impression on the soul. Wherefore, it is impossible for heavenly bodies to make a direct impression on the intellect and the will. Notice he added direct impression. The heavenly bodies cannot make a direct impression on the intellect and will, for this would be to deny the difference between intellect and sense, with which position Aristotle reproaches those who held that such is the will of man, as is the day which the Father of men and gods, that is, the Son of the heavens, brings on. So there's two kinds of effects that are not caused by the heavenly bodies: accidental effects and acts of the free will. Okay, so we talked about that before. There are some effects that are caused by the heavenly bodies and reasonably can be studied and predicted if possible. There are two kinds of events that are not caused by the heavenly bodies: accidental effects and acts of the free will. Okay? Hence, The heavenly bodies cannot be the direct cause of the free will's operations. The heavenly bodies cannot be the direct cause of the free will's operations. Nevertheless, so he says, now hold on a minute, okay? The heavenly bodies cannot be the direct cause of the operations of free will. That is, the heavenly bodies don't force a man to do something or force a man to will something. The heavenly bodies don't control the soul of man. However, he says, nevertheless, they can be a dispositive cause of an inclination to those operations. They can be a dispositive, that means a cause that disposes the person to a certain action, because, he goes on to say, they make an impression on the body, consequently on the sensitive powers, which are acts of the bodily organs, having an inclination for human acts. So this is where things get technical, and we've got to be really careful. The heavenly bodies do not have a direct effect on the human will or on the soul or on the intellect. They don't have a direct effect, but they can have an indirect effect because they influence the body, and the body and the experiences of the body do have an effect on the soul, even though it's indirect. You see the distinction that St. Thomas is making here. So the heavenly bodies can influence the body, and the body in turn can influence the soul through sensation, through the sensitive powers, he says. Since, however, the sensitive powers obey reason, that's how God created us. The sensitive power obey reason, as Aristotle shows. This does not impose any necessity on free will, and man is able, by his reason, to act counter to the inclination of the heavenly bodies. So the heavenly bodies do not necessarily or directly influence human actions, but they can indirectly influence human decisions and actions by influencing the body, which in turn can influence the intellect or the reason. So they can, but we've got to make a careful distinction. There's no necessity. It's not sort of fatalistic. It's indirect, and it can be resisted by human reason, which God has made stronger than that influence. St. Thomas goes on to say, accordingly, if anyone take observation of the stars in order to foreknow casual or fortuitous future events that take place by chance, or to know with certitude future human actions, his conduct is based on a false and vain opinion. And so, because he is seeking what is beyond the limit of nature, he's going beyond what's natural. He is observing the stars in order to foreknow casual, that is chance, or fortuitous, that are events that are under the control of fortune. If we desire to fortune tell, or to try to predict casual events, or to know with some kind of certainty, future human actions, which are not directly influenced by the heavenly bodies, this conduct, this interest, this desire is based on a false and vain opinion. And notice what it says here. And so, the operation of the demon, the evil spirit, introduces itself therein, Wherefore it will be a superstitious and unlawful divination. On the other hand, if one were to apply the observation of the stars in order to foreknow those future things which are caused by the heavenly bodies, for instance, whether there might be a drought or rain or so forth, it will neither be unlawful nor a superstitious divination. Okay, so I think we have our answer here from St. Thomas. And you can see the wisdom of St. Thomas and how he divided this up for us into different circumstances, different detailed situations, so that we can actually see what the cause of the confusion is. And we can make a pretty simple summary of it. Let's start with this. The heavenly bodies, being physical bodies, can influence physical bodies on earth. Therefore, plants, animals, stones, the earth, water, and so on, all of these things, even the air, all of these things can be directly influenced by heavenly bodies. And therefore, by the study of the heavenly bodies, we may be able to make predictions about all of these different elements, these physical elements. Fire, air, water, and earth, the four classical elements. So those things are, in fact, directly influenced by the heavenly bodies, and that study, the pursuit of that knowledge, is reasonable, is not unlawful, and not superstitious. And we all know that. I think we just don't realize how much we do it, how much we actually do get knowledge and predict things in the future based on observation of the heavenly bodies, because it's not us doing the observation. We're just taking in this information without thinking about where it's coming from. So that's clear for us, and that's where the line is drawn, right? Necessary, natural, physical bodies, physical events, physical effects that are necessary, that sort of follow from the so-called laws of nature. That kind of knowledge is reasonable to pursue and lawful. If we go beyond that, however, and we seek the several different kinds of knowledge, the knowledge of human acts, the knowledge of things that are casual or fortuitous, like chance events, like let's say gambling, right? Like I'm rolling the dice. What's it going to be? What's it going to be? The rolling of the dice is a casual event. There's no way to know. It's just going to come out different every time. There's no way to know what the outcome is going to be. The desire to know that, let's say because you're gambling and trying to win money in an unlawful way, you see how that's going beyond the limit. And so to try to use some kind of horoscope or astrology to predict your luck and your lottery number and things like that, now you're going beyond that limit. And we're told here, we're warned by St. Thomas, so the operation of the demon introduces itself at that point, and therefore it is a superstitious and unlawful divination. So you can see why gambling and games of chance used to be forbidden by Christian cultures, Christian societies in the past. We don't think about that very much. Those high-risk, casual or fortuitous activities that put a lot of pressure on us make us vulnerable to moving into superstition. And we're warned that that becomes a spiritual problem. We expose ourselves to that spiritual trouble by going beyond the bounds of what's right and necessary. And then to know human events, human actions, to try to know human actions, to predict human actions, is going too far, and therefore is vain and unlawful and superstitious. Okay, so we can see this clear answer that St. Thomas gives us. We're just about at 1 hour now, and there's one last piece by St. Thomas here in this article, his reply to the second objection, the second argument we read at the beginning of this. And I'm just going to read through this quickly, so forgive me for blitzing through this, but for the sake of completeness, I'd like to just read this. Reply to objection 2, we're down here. That astrologers not unfrequently forecast the truth by observing the stars may be explained in 2 ways. So we see astrologers do this. We see them foretell the future. This may be explained in 2 ways. St. Thomas says, first, a great number of men, even though they're free to act according to reason, they can act with free will. Even though they're free, a great number of men follow their bodily passions, so that their actions are, for the most part, disposed in accordance with the inclination of the heavenly bodies. Because they do not actually control themselves, but simply yield to the impulse of the flesh, they are actually moved by the heavenly bodies. While there are a few men, namely the wise men, who moderate these inclinations by their reason. The result is that astrologers in many cases foretell the truth, especially in public occurrences which depend on the multitude. So things like, fortune telling, how do they work? Because they're true. They're true if you live according to the natural inclinations of the body. The things that the fortune tellers say are going to be true for most people. They won't be true, however, for wise men, because wise men resist the natural inclination of their body and don't act in accordance with the influence of the heavenly bodies. But for the multitude, for the common people, the people who are really vulnerable to fortune telling and things like that, the fortune tellers are going to appear to be true because they are. They're true because the people are not controlling themselves and directing their own behavior by reason and understanding, but are simply moving like natural bodies with no reason or free will, and that's their own fault. Secondly, because of the interference of the demons, that is, because there are spiritual interferences that actually cause these predictions to be or to appear to be true. Hence, Augustine says, and this reference here is his reference to on the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. He says, when astronomers tell the truth, it must be allowed that this is due to an instinct that, unknown to man, lies hidden in his mind. And since this happens through the action of unclean and lying spirits who desire to deceive men, for they are permitted to know certain things about temporal affairs. So it's demonic. Wherefore, Augustine concludes, thus, a good Christian should beware of astrologers and of all impious diviners, especially those who tell the truth. The ones who tell the truth are the dangerous ones, lest his soul become the dupe of the demons, and by making a compact of partnership with them, enmesh itself in their fellowship. So that last paragraph, which I said I would read through quickly, it actually is pretty juicy in terms of the help that it offers us. It says, if we look at these astrologers, and we know, based on St. Thomas's explanation, we know that there are things that cannot be foretold by the heavens, by the observation of the heavens. They can't be, and yet men seek that knowledge anyway. But we often find that the astrologers speak of those things which the heavenly bodies cannot actually predict, and they're often right. And there's two reasons why they're often right. First, because common people follow the impulses of their bodies and are, again, not directly, but indirectly influenced by the heavenly bodies. That's one reason why their fortune-telling is true for the multitude, for the common people. And the other reason is because evil spirits are involved. That's why. Thus, a good Christian should beware of astrologers, especially those who tell the truth. So, I think this article here in the Summa Theologica clearly answers this question. Clearly answers this question. Is all astrology bad? Nope. Astrology is not bad. There is one species of astrology that's perfectly fine, and it's the use of the knowledge of the heavenly bodies to predict necessary natural events among physical bodies on earth. That's perfectly reasonable, not superstitious, not unlawful. But once we go beyond that, the saying, curiosity killed the cat. Once we go beyond that and we want to try to know the future of human actions, which the heavenly bodies cannot reveal to us, we've gone too far. We make ourselves vulnerable not merely to deception, but to the influence and fellowship of evil spirits at that point. So knowing that we cannot predict future human actions, we should never seek that information. We should never seek that knowledge. And because the heavenly bodies, the knowledge of the heavenly bodies cannot forecast casual or fortuitous future events that happen by chance or by fortune, and Aristotle explains the difference between chance and fortune. I think it's in the Ethics. Because we can't know those things, and the heavenly bodies cannot foretell casual or fortuitous events. Likewise, the pursuit of that kind of knowledge, and I use the example of gambling, rolling the dice and trying to predict what the outcome will be so that we can bet our money or something like that, guess the lottery numbers and so on. Even, guess the outcome of the football game so we can bet on the football game and try to win. You can see how all of these things tie into this. The observation of the heavenly bodies cannot reveal that kind of information, and the desire for it is superstitious and unlawful. It's vain. What does he say? Vain and superstitious, I think he says. Vain and superstitious. Unlawful and superstitious. Once we show ourselves to be interested in that information, we make ourselves vulnerable to the deceptions of evil spirits, which can reveal the truth because it can be made known to them to punish us for seeking that information. So we expose ourselves to some dangerous stuff, and we leave ourselves subject to deception at the very least. So what's important for us, if we want to think wisely, is to understand these careful divisions that St. Thomas teaches us, so we can think about this. And what's really helpful here is that we now have principles. We have a set of principles to guide us in these issues. If someone's talking about astrological kind of stuff and they're simply talking about natural events, that's not anything to worry about. That's just scientific forecasting, right? That's okay. If they want to know about human actions, now they're getting into trouble. because human actions, we have to make it understood. Human actions are subject to human choice, human free will, human reason. They can't be predicted. Man is ultimately in control of his actions, not the stars. The heavens didn't make me do it. I didn't resist the influence to do evil. It's my fault, because I'm created with understanding and free will for that purpose. I'm accountable for the deeds done by my body. And then if we seek information, or if someone is seeking information on events that take place by chance or by fortune, that again is unlawful. Okay, so we have a good set of principles that I think answers this question. And so for the original question, which was getting into questions of Hinduism and Christianity and astrology and marriages and agricultural activities, and all, you have a clear set of principles now that you can use, right? You can understand that it's not just this question of astrology in general. You can't have an overly simplified response to it, because it wouldn't be true. There are events that can be predicted by astrology, but then you can pay attention to what specifically people are seeking, and whether it's those subjects, that knowledge that actually cannot be truly forecast by the observation of the heavens, and you can oppose that because it's wrong, and you can explain why it's wrong, which I think is most important. So we're already at 1 hour and 10 minutes, so I need to stop this, but I hope that's helpful. I'm happy to go into this further. That's just, my first response to that question. I think that what I've said is helpful, even though I could make it clearer or more succinct if I wasn't just sort of talking off the cuff here like I do in these talks. But I think what St. Thomas teaches us is clear, and again, that's from Article 5 of question 95 of the second part of the Summa. I'll put a link to that, a reference, in the comments section of the YouTube video. But I hope that's helpful. If there's any other aspect of this you'd like to dig into and talk about, just comment or send me a message. I'd be happy to do that. I hope that's helpful. God bless.